human experiments that actually happened. Let's watch.
The CIA knew that it was breaking, every moral, ethical, and legal law in the books to do these experiments.
The most embarrassing aspect of the whole story was that the final results for this cruel test were not even noteworthy.
He says he's not going to go on. Please continue.
He says he doesn't want to go on.
We must continue.
Today, experiments have strict rules to protect people, but that wasn't always the case. In the past, researchers experimented on people without considering the consequences, and the damage often lasted a lifetime. In this video, we'll explore evil human experiments that actually happened, starting with the unsettling cases and ending with the most horrifying. So it is the new year, guys, and I want to encourage you guys to be the best version of yourselves that you can be. And it would mean the world if you subscribe, and I promise to do my best to make the best videos I possibly can for you. I'm Visual Venture, and you are awesome. MK Ultra.
I think one of the things that is so crazy is, like, if you've been on the internet for long enough, you've seen the creepypastas of, like, the Russian sleep experiments, which, didn't happen. But the reason why those creepypastas or internet horror stories went so far is because the actual experiments, like the CIA, FBI, KGB, all those, like, and other government bodies, and especially the government bodies you don't hear of, are so insane and sick and crazy, and they actually happened, that things like, it made up, examples that are just, like, maybe a little bit too far, or, like, have a supernatural ending or twist or something. People, they either believe them or they want to believe them because they're thinking, if this, and the thing that I think about quite often is, if we know about these experiments, if we have public record of what we're about to watch, you can only imagine how bad and how sick and twisted the experiments are that we aren't allowed to watch. And that's something that I think about all the time. I mean, I don't think about it all the time, but it really is something I think about when this comes out. I mean, it's almost like all the stuff that's leaked for, like, leaked FBI files or leaked CIA files that are put out there, and they're super redacted, and some of them are just absurd. It's crazy how it's like the conspiracy theorists are always proved right. I mean, obviously not always. There's a bit of survivorship bias, and, well, this one was right. Okay, well, the 1,000 other that were wrong. But especially recently, it just seems like they're on a heater. They're on a winning streak for being right about things, and it's kind of scary because these are the things we're allowed to see. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not someone who sits there and tries to connect the dots. I'm just like, that's just not a productive use of my time. It's probably not healthy for me to sit there and think about this, but it really does make you think. And let's get into the first one.
For years, the MK Ultra experiment sounded like a made-up story. Many believed it was simply too cruel to be real. But in 1973, the truth came out. Declassified CIA files confirmed that MK Ultra actually happened, and it involved illegal human experiments.
It was the most secret program ever conducted by the CIA in the United States.
But the worst part was not how extreme the experiments were. It was that people were forced to take part in it. MK Ultra officially began in 1953. At that time, the CIA believed other countries were developing brainwashing and mind control techniques. But there was no evidence to confirm this, so the agency didn't want to fall behind. So they launched MK Ultra. The goal was clear: find ways to erase the memory and then control the mind.
Can we actually, like, control a person's personality? Can we make them behave in certain ways, make them do something?
MK Ultra quickly grew into a massive operation. It included more than 150 separate projects. These projects took place in universities, hospitals, and even in public. And some of the methods were so inappropriate that keeping this a secret became necessary.
The CIA knew that it was breaking, every moral, ethical, and legal law in the books to do these experiments.
One of the CIA's main tools was mind-altering drugs. Researchers wanted to know whether dosing people made them easier to control.
Even people in the public were given drugs without their awareness or consent and experimented upon.
But
I might be completely wrong on this. I might be completely out of left field, but wasn't Ted Krasinski, like, is that his name, Ted Krasinski? Didn't he partake in some of these experiments? And I'm sure he was a little bit crazy in general, but didn't that, like, bring him farther? I might be completely wrong. But another thing too, which is kind of absurd. Like during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the absolute crackdown on these illegal drugs, only for them to be used without consent in these experiments. The thing that, like, with these, like, if it was a study where it's like, hey, we're going to give you this, here's what it could do, we honestly don't know the extent to which it can, what it'll do, take this at your own risk, I still think that's a little sus. But the fact, like, here that is kind of unnerving to me, and I actually didn't know this part going in, because I knew, like, a little bit about, I knew the name MK Ultra, and I knew that there's some crazy experiments. I knew it was, like, a little bit, like, LSD type, whatever. But I didn't know the fact that they didn't tell the participants about it. Like, I kind of feel like that has to be, that has to be a massive issue. Like, that has to be a huge problem. I'm not tripping on it. Like, I feel like the government not telling you that you're going to have this insane mind-altering drug and experience is one of the biggest issues with this. I'm sure the experiments were pretty bad too, but it's the fact that you were tricked into doing them is just like, and also, like, to my knowledge, there's like no repercussions from this. And that's one thing I think a lot of people get upset about is, like, if a rogue body in the US government does something illegal and they get reprimanded for it and they're, held up to the letter of the law, like all of us, then it wouldn't make it right, but it would at least feel like there was more justice that happened, if that makes sense at all. And it feels like here that it's part of what the issue is that, like, there is no justice. And to my knowledge, no one got arrested for stuff like this, but let's keep going.
Secretly dosing people sometimes ended in disaster. Frank Olson's story is a perfect example. Olson was a scientist working with U.S. intelligence. In 1953, he attended a meeting with colleagues. During that meeting, the CIA spiked Olson's drink with a truth serum. He had no idea. Agents stood nearby and watched how it affected him. When the substance took effect, Olson became emotionally unstable. A witness described him as disoriented. The effect lasted for days. 1 week later, Olson was staying at a hotel. He suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and ran around the room in his underwear. Then he fell from a hotel window. He didn't survive. But Olson wasn't the only victim of MK Ultra. Many MK Ultra experiments took place in hospitals and psych wards. The patients were already vulnerable. Instead of receiving proper care, they were treated like guinea pigs. MK Ultra doctors wanted to learn how to erase memories.
And he thought that if you could bring a person back down to a blank slate, remove all the environmental inputs that have been put into them, and then you can build them back up in your image into whatever you want them to be.
The methods used were too extreme for me to describe. Many patients didn't understand what was happening. That made it nearly impossible for them to refuse. By the time patients were discharged, they were seriously affected. Experiments also took place in prisons. Inmates were given substances and their reactions were closely monitored. The program continued for nearly 10 years, and so many of the things they did were illegal.
They were also experimenting with aerosol LSD. Like, can we disperse it into a crowd? Can we disperse it over a city? What does it do in water supplies? And just some insane stuff.
In 1963, the CIA officially ended MK Ultra. This was the explanation recorded inside the CIA director's office.
His office reported, "The concepts involved in manipulating human behavior are found by many people, both within and outside the agency, to be distasteful and unethical."
After the program ended, the CIA director ordered most MK Ultra files destroyed. The goal was to keep the experiments hidden, but that plan failed. A few years after it ended, a reporter found out about the program and blew the whistle.
In 1974, Seymour Hersh exposed the MK Ultra program when he wrote about it for the New York Times.
The article caused public outrage. Soon after, Congress launched an investigation. The CIA was forced to admit the truth.
During those hearings, the CIA finally admitted that this program existed. They admitted that it was probably not the right thing to do, but
The thing that is, I mean, there's so many levels of this that are just kind of sick and twisted, but one of the levels of it being sick and twisted is that it took them 10 years to be like, you know what? Maybe this is a bad idea. And like going into like mental hospitals where you go there because you're already having severe issues and you're there for help, and then the CIA comes in and just blows up your brain even more. You're already in such an incredibly fragile state when that happens that it like, to me, it's just like, I mean, it's almost like, crimes that protect, like, children, for example, because, like, children don't have, like, that full, like, prefrontal cortex understanding the world. That's also why, like, I feel that, like, reactions to crimes against children are, like, you just get even so much more of, like, a gut punch because of that almost injustice of it. A crime, like, committed against someone who's, like, fully aware and understanding is still a crime. It's still bad, and you still, like, get kind of like this sick feeling with it. But it's like there's levels to it when it's someone who can't do anything about it. And it's very similar to a mental hospital. I'm not saying, like, if everyone in a mental hospital has the capacity as a child. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But you are impaired to some way, and you are there to get help. So to come in here and to do, it's just, like, next level. And every single one of these experiments, it was something where someone didn't know and or was against their will. General public. If they were not told, it was against their will. In this case, it was against their will, and they were probably not told. And also with, like, the prisoners, like, they probably, even if they were told a little bit, it was probably similar to the public where it probably was done very much against their will, because also you're in prison. They're probably like, you have to do this. And they probably weren't told the full extent. So, like, super sick and twisted, not good.
They feigned innocence.
By then, most of the records were destroyed. That meant the full scope of MK Ultra would never be known, and victims were left without justice. Up next is an experiment that intentionally instilled fear in people. The Landis facial expression experiment. In 1924, psychologist Carney Landis began a study on human reactions. He wanted to know if everyone makes the same face when they feel the same emotion, like fear, disgust, and so on. I mean, it was a reasonable question, but in trying to find the answer, Landis created one of the most horrifying experiments ever, and those who suffered most were his test subjects. Landis recruited young college students for the study. On paper, the plan was simple. He was going to trigger emotions like disgust and joy and capture them on camera.
So he needs to get you to feel emotions to get a picture of your face.
The first thing he did was paint thick black lines across each volunteer's face. He said the markings would help track facial expressions in photos. Next, he mounted a camera on the wall. It was positioned to capture everything. At this point, it still looked like a normal psychology study, but things were about to get dark. Landis wanted to see the face people made when they felt uncomfortable. To trigger that reaction, he showed volunteers a set of unsettling images.
Then he shows you medical photos of people with horrendous skin conditions.
The volunteers were clearly distressed, and the camera recorded every reaction. Next, Landis moved on to fear.
Then he goes behind a curtain and sets off a firecracker to capture on film the exact moment of your fright.
He didn't just use firecrackers. Landis also fired a weapon close to the volunteers. Once again, his goal was to capture at the exact moment of their fright. Then the experiment escalated. Landis told the volunteers to close their eyes and stick their hands into a metal bucket. Inside, they felt something slimy. The bucket was full of live frogs, kicking and squirming. Landis recorded their expressions, but he wasn't finished. He instructed them to search the bottom of the bucket for an object.
So after searching through all these frogs for some time, finally, the participant found their surprise.
Their hands touched a live electrical coil. An electrical shock ripped through their bodies.
So the participants were also getting shocked by that time. And that time, they were facial expressions were also recorded.
Still, Landis wasn't satisfied. He wanted stronger reactions. Landis brought out a small mouse. It was live. Then he ordered each volunteer to end the mouse.
And if they didn't, he would do it for them in front of them while they watched.
Almost everyone asked Landis if he was joking. They quickly realized he wasn't. Landis wanted to take a photo of their faces as they carried out the act. Many volunteers refused at first, but Landis pressured them. One by one, most of them gave in. About 1/3 refused to do it themselves, but Landis didn't let them off the hook. Landis did it himself. He made them watch. The camera clicked again and again. The experiment was over. Now it was time to assess the results. After triggering all of these emotions, Landis reviewed the photos, and he found no clear pattern. There was no typical facial expression.
And after all that, nothing. I will say, when this started, when he was explaining the experiment, I actually thought, oh, this experiment is somewhat interesting. Do people have the same kind of set of reactions? And I'm sure it'd be like slight differences because everyone's face is a little bit different. They're the muscles in your face and the way your brain reacts, and there's gonna be variance. But I'm like, does it like kind of all fall within, if you normalize it, like does it all fall within like pretty tightly at least one standard, like within that like a certain quintile, like they're all here, and then there's some outliers, and it turns out no, which like okay. If you conducted this experiment not like a psychopath, and the other thing too is like probably extreme reactions will have the most variance. I think it would be honestly interesting for mild disgust, mild horror, mild shock, mild this, like mild happiness. Like that's the other thing too. It doesn't sound like he was like, oh, I'm gonna give you $1 million, or like he isn't like seeing for the good. Like this guy just seems like a psycho. I think he just like came up with something to have a reason, to have some rationale behind, oh, well, I'm just gonna, it's for science, but he just is a sicko, bro. Because I don't hear anything about, well, here's the experiment where I figured out like if everyone's joy is the same, if their deep love reactions are the same. So not only do I think it'd be potentially, and I'm not a scientist, don't get me wrong, like would be a better experiment if they were able to, if it was less emotion, but still in that kind of like the vector points in that direction of that emotion, but it's not like the vector is so far out, like extreme. I think you'd probably see more of a pattern there if you were to see a pattern. Maybe there's no pattern, but also why are we only doing the evil emotions? And then this guy comes out and is like, I need you to murder a live rat, and then shoots a gun next to them. Like, there's so many levels of this being sick and twisted, dude, that like, all right, let's see how this ends.
For any emotion. Fear, disgust, and shock look different from person to person. In fact, smiling was the most common reaction even during unpleasant experiences. When Landis published his findings, many people criticized how the volunteers were treated. The part involving the mouse caused the most outrage. That's why today, the Landis facial expression experiment is remembered for its cruelty, not its science. Up next is an experiment that had lasting consequences on a child. The Little Albert experiment. Fear is a survival tool. It warns us when danger is near. But for decades, psychologists argued about where fear comes from. Are we born with it, or does the world teach us what to fear? In 1920, two researchers decided to stop debating and find out for themselves. They wanted to train someone to fear something specific, even if that thing was harmless. Before the experiment could begin, they ran into a major issue. They couldn't use adults. Adults already have memories and life experiences, so they know what's scary and what isn't. The researchers needed someone with no sense of what could be scary. Ideally, they needed a baby. The researchers eventually found a baby in the hospital where they worked. His mother was a nurse at the same hospital. The baby's real name was never recorded. In the study, he was called Albert B. Albert was only 9 months old. The researchers planned to teach him.
Look, this is something where this is an interesting theoretical concept of, can you teach someone to be afraid of something? In the same way that they did the, I think it was like, I don't remember the exact details, but where they, for a dog, I don't know if they did this with people too, but like where they rang a bell and gave a treat and see if there's like the salivation that went off, and then they rang a bell, like did that again and again to see if they could get that reaction by that connection. They found it was true. I think that there are plenty of really interesting open questions that could be researched and could be found out. But if you have to do something to a baby, and it's questionable if there's going to be long-term psychological impacts, I think there's just so many interesting things in the world of human psychology and physics and math and biology. There's so many interesting research topics that how about, unless it's life and death for the human population, how about we just leave the babies out of it, bro? Leave the small children out of it. Is that such a crazy thing to say? Because it sounds like this was just like, oh yeah, we'll just traumatize a baby for this kind of interesting question that doesn't really do anything. That's the thing too, I'm actually all for science just to answer questions that don't immediately impact us. Also because sometimes like later down the line, different fields will be able to connect, and just having that research out there is great. And I'm very pro research, even if there isn't a direct, obvious reason for it. You can think of, the research of like all the physics that went behind the internet before it was obvious that that's what it's going to do, and like how I can make this video now, or the research of like, you know, applying linear algebra to these machine learning models and like trying to build this all the way back in the 60s. Like there was, no one was like, oh yeah, and then we're gonna make chat GBT and we're gonna have AI slop everywhere. It's like, research for the sake of research is great. But I also think then it's like, if there's not a life and death reason to do it, like let's not do the traumatizing baby experiments. Maybe I'm a crazy person. Maybe you guys are gonna hate me in the comment section. Connor, we should traumatize babies for no reason. That is a great idea. And if that's the case, man, I guess you and I are just different people, and that's okay. But I'm already uncomfortable with this, but let's let it go. Let's continue.
Fear. To do this, they used a method called classical conditioning. Here's the concept. If you pair something harmless with something frightening, the brain may link the two. If you repeat that pairing enough times, the brain learns a new rule. This object means danger. The researchers decided to test this idea on little Albert. They began by showing him a white lab rat. Albert showed no fear. He tried to touch the rat. Next, they showed him a rabbit, a dog, and a monkey. None of the animals frightened him.
First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, little Albert had no fears of any animals.
At that point, the scientists needed a way to trigger fear. They struck a steel bar using a hammer. The noise startled Albert and he burst into tears. Now, they knew what made him scared. The researchers showed Albert the rat again. He smiled and reached for it just like before. At that exact moment, they made the loud noise again.
In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat.
Albert heard the noise and cried. To strengthen the connection, they repeated the process. After several rounds, the scientists finally got the result they wanted. Albert didn't need to hear the noise anymore. Seeing the rat alone made him cry.
The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rat.
They successfully taught a baby to fear something specific, but the experiment wasn't over yet. The researchers wanted to see if Albert's fear would transfer to similar objects. So they placed a rabbit in front of Albert. It was white and furry, just like the rat. Albert cried. Next, they brought in a dog and a monkey. He cried again. It seemed Albert was scared of anything soft, white, or furry. They even showed him a Santa Claus beard, and he burst into tears. The researchers planned to remove the fear later, but they never got the chance. Albert's mother suddenly left the hospital with her child. Maybe she realized something was wrong. No one knows for sure. What we do know is this: Albert never received treatment to reverse the fear. For decades, Albert's identity remained a mystery. Researchers only knew he was born around 1919. Finally, in 2014, investigators believed they finally identified him. They concluded that he was a man named Albert Barger. They wanted to interview him, but they couldn't. Albert already passed away at the age of 87. Instead, they spoke with his family. They described Albert as gentle and calm, but there was something strange about him. Albert couldn't stand being around animals. It was so bad that family members had to keep their dogs in a separate room when he visited. If Albert Barger was really little Albert, it's possible that the fear from the experiment never faded. The little Albert experiment showed that fear can be learned through classical conditioning, but the fact that they used a baby was just wrong. This next case answered the question.
So this is something really, pretty messed up. Also, like, if you're going to do this experiment and you're like, well, we're going to reverse it later, yet keep track. Oh, the baby disappeared. Are you not paying attention? This is like the most nonchalant study of just traumatizing a random baby of all time. But it's also really interesting. You know, it's something I've noticed where I think it's kind of still an open debate of nurture versus nature, where it does look like quite a lot of our, you know, how we're wired, how we're built is from the genetics of the mother and father, right? It's not a crazy thing to think, well, if your eye color is 100% inherited and your height potential is 100% inherited, like minus nutrition or malnutrition, I should say, that certain components of you, I mean, you can see it in, intelligence IQ is like a little bit like, it's a little iffy of like how you actually measure that, as it's probably more than just one number. But there is like very high, like it's like R.79 or something really high. It's like really high correlation. Like you can see it through, and there's reversion to the mean with this. There's this really interesting Google Talk study in 2010 that's released on YouTube if you want to look at it. Mental illness is very, heritable, which is interesting. But then also there's this big component of when your brain is most plastic, when you're a small child, those things that you don't remember, because like I barely remember, I just crack my finger, in a way that was weird. I barely remember anything, when I'm younger than 4. I don't think I remember almost anything. But also during that period when you're in the most like adaptive learning, like you're learning languages, you're learning spatial awareness, those moments are going to be the most impactful throughout your life. And this is something where, you see people when they're 20, 30, 40, 50, all the way through their lives, and they have these almost like, pathologies, like all these things where it's like you're, too dependent in relationships, you're too clingy. It's like, yes, that's maybe sometimes based on like your other relationships, but it might be based on your, human interactions when you're younger with your mother and father. Were they present? Were they there? Like all these different components. And it's really fascinating how impactful that early stage is, but that doesn't take away from how messed up it is to do this to a child, and then also just to let them go. And the fact that this guy probably lived his entire life probably more than just afraid of dogs. Whenever you have something when your brain kind of wired like that, it's the fear is going to go much farther, and it probably had all these other impacts on his relationships and his general mental health. He might have had, when you have one condition, it's often there's like, it's comorbid with a bunch of other conditions, and there's like those kind of connections there. And needless to say, this is pretty messed up.
How easily can you make a good person do bad things? The Milgram shock experiment. Most people believe they are good. In the early 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram decided to test that belief.
Stanley Milgram was interested in the psychology of obedience.
Milgram designed an experiment to answer one dark question. Can a good person be pressured into doing something evil simply because their leader or boss orders them to? Milgram's question was inspired by the events of World War II. After the war, many people involved in horrific crimes were put on trial. Almost all of them gave the same excuse. They were just following orders. As a psychologist, Milgram found this blind obedience deeply troubling. He wanted to know if ordinary Americans could also be pressured to hurt others.
Here's the thing. This is a genuinely fascinating question. This is where this is so conflicting, because also something like this, I'm sure that the way he did this is messed up, and I'm going to be like, this is sick and twisted. But throughout history, the psychology of the mob, that individual people are not coming to these conclusions to do these heinous crimes. And it's almost, it goes back, I don't know if it was Carl Jung who said something along these lines, or is one of these people where, a truly good person is not someone who does not commit crimes or does not commit evil things. That's probably a good thing, but it's the person who understands their capacity for evil and has the ability to enact it, but chooses not to. That is the mark of a good person, right? Because it really seems like everyone has some, it's not like, oh, everyone can't do this. And when you look at history, and even, when I look at history, I'm like, God, that's disgusting, that's horrible. How could you do this? But if you look at the individual people who did this, are they all psychopaths? Statistically, no. That's the thing too. If you look, there's a percentage of the population who are more they are psychopaths clinically. And since there are still psychopaths over thousands and thousands of years, there's probably a genetic reason why it passed on. If anything passes on, there's usually a reason. Well, not always. There's sometimes variance, but probably those were the people who, when you're in those kind of 200-person tribes thousands of years ago, those are the people who had to go and murk a bunch of other people and not even second guess it, right? So this is such a genuinely interesting question and if we got a better understanding of human psychology, would we be able, and on this question specifically, would we be able to use that to then better understand how to prevent mass atrocities, group genocide type situations in the future? And that is a genuinely interesting question. And I'm sure that he's about to try to solve it in the sickest way possible. So let's just let it rip.
decided to see how subjects would react when a researcher pushed them to do things that went against their morals.
The first step was selecting volunteers from his experiment. He put out an ad offering $4 for 1 hour of their time. But Milgram turned away anyone with a violent history or criminal record. He wanted everyday people who knew right from wrong. Once the volunteers were selected, the experiment began. Milgram conducted the study at Yale University, but he lied to the volunteers about the purpose of the experiment.
Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Each volunteer sat at a desk with a machine in front of them. That machine delivers a shock. Wires connected the machine to a chair in the next room. Each volunteer watched as another man was strapped into the chair. Electrodes were attached to his body. Then a barrier was placed between them. From that moment on, the volunteer could not see the person in the electric chair. The instructions were straightforward. The volunteer would ask a question. The man in the chair would answer. If the answer was wrong, the volunteer pressed a switch and delivered an electric shock.
You're going to read these words out and see if he can remember them. And if he gets it wrong, you hit this button and deliver a shock.
But the shocks weren't all the same.
He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
That was the task. Press a button and shock another person for making a mistake. Milgram wanted to see how far volunteers would go before they refused.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong.
Each shock triggered a reaction from the man in the chair.
Answer. Wrong. 150 volts.
However, there was one more thing the volunteer didn't know. The man in the chair was an actor. He wasn't actually being shocked. His reactions were fake. As the experiment continued, the actor yelled to stop.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
At this point, the volunteers hesitated.
He says he's not going to go on. Please continue.
He says he doesn't want to go on.
We must continue.
But the researchers insisted they continue.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
And most volunteers did. They felt they were doing something wrong, but they kept pushing the button.
So the guy keeps getting it wrong, keeps getting it wrong. Around 250 volts, he's screaming.
Some volunteers strongly protested.
I'm not going to kill that man in there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
Eventually, the man in the other room went silent.
I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer.
At that point, the experiment ended. Milgram published the results in 1963.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so.
In total, 65% of volunteers went all the way to the maximum 400.
So in this one, this is something where I want to be careful because I see way too much on the internet and it genuinely annoys me where there is example, this would be, there's a public situation where someone, it's like a shooter or they pull out a knife on a train and everyone's like, you might see, there's the courageous stories of people who stop the shooter. Sometimes they lose their own life doing it. And those are incredibly sad. But there's also videos of like bystanders there who don't do anything. And the comments, sometimes I see like, I can't believe they just were there and did nothing. If I was there, I would have, buddy, you would have not done anything. You would have not done jack, bro. Let's be so real. And in those situations, I'm going to be honest, I wouldn't be like, you know what, I'm going to go in. Because like fight or flight mode and the fear in that moment, you're not calibrating. You're sitting on TikTok. You're sitting in your warm bed being like, oh, dude, I would totally. No, you wouldn't. There's a very, very, very small percentage of people. And those people probably have some kind of, they're probably wired in a way that they can do. And that doesn't take anything away from the bravery, by the way. I'm just trying to like make a meta-analysis here. So I'm going to be very careful when I say I would stop after a couple of shocks. Like, it's really something where if the person is like, please stop, I genuinely believe I would just stop that experiment. It doesn't matter how much, because you don't get paid that much. You get paid like $200 to do this. And if they're like, no, it's completely under control, I just be like, okay, well, I don't feel comfortable doing this because this other person feels in pain. Like, I'm also someone who's very much like, I can't even like swat a fly. Like I will be the person who goes and there's a scary spider in my basement. I will get the cup and paper method. I don't know if you know that, where it's like you take a cup, you put it over the spider or whatever animal, and then you slowly, so you don't hurt it, slowly slide a piece of paper under it so that you can then lift both up, and then you can put it outside. That's what I do. So like, I could not do this. It's interesting that almost 2/3, like a percentage away from basically being 2/3 of people administered it's not as if, it's not like, oh, well, everyone in that experiment was told that 450 volts would kill someone. No, it's like, that's not what I'm saying, but it's like the reaction from the other person. If they're saying like, oh, please stop, like, I don't know, like, that's something where I think I would just stop. Because also for me, it's like, I'm not getting much out of this. I'm probably just bored on a Tuesday. You got work off or something. I'm getting $200. I'd be like, no, dude, I'm out of here. Like, it's not worth it. And like, kind of wasting my day, and this is kind of scary to me. And I'm probably going to report this, low-key, because this is weird. I just don't understand. And maybe, and I'm being really careful of not trying to be like, well, from my perspective, sitting in this comfy chair in my room, I wouldn't do something because it's bad. I'm trying to be really careful not to be that guy, but I genuinely just could not see myself doing this. But let's see what the reaction is, because this one also, and I'm going to hold this point until I watch the video, because my initial thoughts are like, the other experiments so far have been really messed up, and this one's just like, no one got hurt, no one really got damaged. Maybe some of the participants were like, oh my God, but they were told, right? I'm assuming. So I want to see why this is number 3 on the sick and twisted list, because they progressively got worse. Like, right now, I see this as kind of weird and kind of a violation, but nothing like the other ones.
50 volts. That meant that if the shocks were real, they would have ended the person in the chair. Milgram's experiment proved something disturbing. People don't need to be evil to do harm. Sometimes they just have to be told to do it.
Decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
This next case shows how you can cause permanent...
Okay. Well, we got the end of that case, and the next one's probably bad. That one didn't seem like a messed up experiment. And also, I don't know if that experiment was as conclusive. Like, the conclusions that because of this experiment, the results of this, people can do things as bad as, like, the Nazis. I don't know if I would jump to that conclusion. I think a lot of people went beyond what their conscience would tell them to do. But it seemed like they would ask the person saying, hey, is this person okay? Is this monitored? Like, this is all within the fine. Like, it does. I did not listen and hear, and tell me if I'm wrong, that they said, oh, at 450 volts, you're murdering the other person. With the Nazis and a lot of other situations, you actively knew that you were killing people. You actively knew that. And a lot of people who claim not to is a lot of cognitive dissonance, or they were just lying, right? You're just lying to yourself or lying to other people, and you totally knew. If this is like a controlled experiment that you're causing harm to other people, I think it does show that like people's conscience will bend. And I do believe in that because, well, I believe in it because historically, it's proven to be pretty true. First of all, I don't think this one should be ranked as 3. I also know for like YouTube retention reasons, put kind of a bad one at the start and say that they get progressively worse. But like, I think this one is fascinating. I don't think this is that bad. Personally, and you can tell me why it's messed up. It's kind of messed up, but like to the levels of the other one. And then I also don't think that it yields the strong conclusion of like, this is why the Nazis, no. That's too strong of a conclusion, in my opinion. But let's watch the next one. This one's probably bad.
Damage to someone by using only words. The monster study. What could make an experiment so disturbing that people called it the monster study? The study was created by Wendell Johnson. He was a respected professor at the University of Iowa. Despite his success, he lived with a deep personal struggle. Johnson stuttered a lot. Stuttering is a speech impediment that disrupts the normal flow of speaking. Back in the 1930s, doctors believed stuttering was caused by a biological defect. In other words, stutterers were simply born that way. But Johnson had a different theory based on his personal experience.
Apparently, he had spoken normally his whole life until the age of about 5 or 6, when a teacher told his parents that he was starting to exhibit a bit of a stutter.
That comment from his teacher was a trigger. Johnson became anxious about speaking. Over time, he actually developed a stutter.
Looking back, he concluded that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Had he not been so worried about not developing a stutter and so obsessed over his speech, he never would have become a stutterer.
Johnson wanted to prove that stuttering was caused by negative feedback, not biology. To do this, he needed kids he could study without interference. In 1939, Johnson walked into an orphanage and told the staff a lie. He said he wanted to give the children speech therapy. The staff agreed, thinking Johnson was there to help. Johnson ran the study with his graduate student, Mary Tudor. Together, they selected 20...
Once again, going back to what I said earlier, things that are interesting like this, like there are all these cases where it's probably a mix of nurture and nature. It's probably not a binary yes, no, nurture or nature and 0% of the other one for most. And it's just kind of like, for most things, it's probably a little bit murky, but you can see where it's more of the other. Once again, this is an interesting conclusion or an interesting question, but let's leave the kids out of it, dude. Like, can we just have a regulation where we leave the kids out of these experiments? Unless it's like, hey, we have this great medical treatment, this kid has stage 4 cancer, the parents approve, the kid doesn't understand. Like, there's cases like that where, okay, bro. But things like this where it's like an interesting question, and also there's already a bunch of flags against this. He's going in and lying to the school. There should be something where you can't lie in one of these studies, even maybe not across the board. If it's potentially harmful, and I know we're getting into so much nuance, so I'm just going to move past this. I just don't like the lying part. And then also it seems more like a respectable teacher, right? It seems more as if that he is coming from a place of wanting to prove something wrong for his own personal gain. Yes, this would be a really interesting question in general, but this is a mix of, one, you're doing it on kids, which, like, bro, that's a no from me. But then also, two, it seems to be also rooted in your own personal vendetta, which is going to make you go be above and beyond and really bend the rules, if not break them, which I feel like a lot of these rules were broken, just to prove something right to other people. And when you're masking it under science and research and you have this authority, that's where it gets kind of sick and twisted. Doing it on kids and then that component, a mix of that, like, yeah, this is messed up, but let's see what actually happens.
2 kids. Some were stutterers, others were not. The researchers divided them into 4 groups. The first group was made up of kids who already stuttered. The goal was to help them feel calm so that their stuttering stopped, so the researchers praised them all the time. Everyone in the second group was also a stutterer. In this case, the researchers wanted them to feel anxious so their stutter would worsen, therefore they were criticized constantly. The third group was full of children who spoke normally. They were praised and encouraged to keep speaking just the way they were. Then there was the final group. These children spoke perfectly before the study, but the researchers wanted to make them start stuttering. To achieve that, they were constantly criticized. They were accused of stuttering even when their words were clear.
They were told, you must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right.
After that, the researchers recorded what happened to each group. The 2 groups that received negative feedback were deeply affected. The children who already stuttered became more anxious, and just like Johnson predicted, their stuttering got worse. But what about those the researchers were trying to turn into stutterers? Well, that didn't work. The criticism did not make them suddenly start stuttering. However, it shattered their self-confidence.
Every child in this group began to struggle in school. Some of them refused to talk, even to their friends.
One was so distressed that she ran away from the orphanage. This clip sums it up well.
The children who were given negative feedback became more withdrawn, self-conscious, and frustrated, whether or not they actually had a stutter to begin with.
When Johnson shared the results with his colleagues, they were horrified. They warned him that publishing the study could destroy his career. According to reports, they were the ones who nicknamed it the monster study. Johnson never published the study. He hid the documents and hoped his actions would stay buried.
The children also weren't debriefed after the project was over, and there was no real follow-up on how they may have been affected by the study long-term.
When Johnson passed away, he was praised as a respected professor. At that point, no one knew about the orphans, but that changed in 2001. A reporter uncovered records of the monster experiment. When the story became public, people were outraged. Some of the kids from the experiment were still alive. They were now in their 80s. Most claimed they struggled with anxiety and shame. The survivors sued the state of Iowa, which is where the study took place. In 2007, the state paid almost $1 million in compensation. There was no debate. The monster experiment should have never happened. This next experiment got so destructive it had to be stopped early. The Stanford prison experiment. This experiment was designed to create an atmosphere of oppression. The man behind it was psychologist Philip Zimbardo. For years, Zimbardo studied how people behave in prisons, the military, and even offices in each place.
So this is just a thought I just had. I wonder how many psychologists, I'm sure that some of them, like people, because like I actually find it really interesting to study people, because like that's everything. It's love, relationships, business, interaction, history. The study of people is everything. So I think it is actually really fascinating. And probably some are like deeply interested in people and have love for people and have that understanding, right? I would probably I'd put myself more in that category, actually, especially compared to this other category I'm about to speak about. I wonder how many are like diagnosed psychopaths where they have no emotion connection, or I don't want to like explain a definition of a formal diagnosis and have it be incorrect, but you know, where it's like they don't have that ability to feel like, you know, the pain of other people, and they're just like, it's so just an experiment to them, which by the way, for some cases is actually good. For example, heart surgeons, I saw this like video where someone who's like a psychopath is an excellent heart surgeon, because when you're in heart surgery, it's so precise. And if you get this fear of, oh my God, if I mess up, this person's going to die, there's a higher chance that they die. But if you're like, I'm just doing my work, you're actually going to be a much better heart surgeon, right? There's if something passes through the genome, there's usually a reason, not always, but usually, and that's an example, right? So I really wonder, especially after hearing some of these, and I'm sure that there's so many more that can fit in a YouTube video, I wonder what percentage just like have that, like, they just can't, because it would actually make a lot of sense. That would be an interesting study. That would be an interesting study. The study of the studiers, bro. Anyways, let's see what this happens. If this might prove my case, not prove, but imply. I'm trying to be accurate on the internet here. Let's just do it though. Let's watch.
He noticed the same pattern. People in power often treated others badly. Over time, Zimbardo formed a theory. People didn't commit cruel acts because they were born evil. They did them because the situation allowed it. Simply put, power can bring out the worst in people, but it was only a theory. To test it, he needed to create an environment where power could be abused. That idea became the Stanford prison experiment. Zimbardo built a makeshift prison in the basement of a college building. Cameras were installed to record everything that happened. He added cells, a prison yard, and a guard station. The goal was to make the prison feel real enough to shape behavior. Next, he selected 24 college students to take part in the 2-week experiment. Zimbardo split them up into 2 groups. One group became guards, the other became prisoners. To help the guards feel powerful, Zimbardo gave them whistles, batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The sunglasses hid the guards' eyes, making it easier to act without empathy. Zimbardo never told the guards to be cruel or misuse their power. He simply gave them authority and watched what happened. The prisoners, on the other hand, were stripped of anything personal. They wore identical clothing that erased their individuality. Their names were replaced with ID numbers,
so that they would begin to think of themselves anonymously as numbers, and no longer as people with names and identities.
From the start, the imbalance was clear. On the first day, the guards were polite and careful. They still saw the prisoners as fellow students.
This is unreasonable. You cut my clothes.
I know that this is about to be super messed up. I know. But I'm just thinking about me and my boys from college. If we did this, it'd be so fun. Okay, maybe it'd get bad, right? Because this experiment's going to show up how it'd get bad. But I'm just thinking how much trolling that would go on. It would be pretty funny, at least for the first couple hours. I'm sure it'd get darker, a problem, or be an issue. Actually, with some of the guys I know, yeah, there's an issue day, moment 1, minute 1, second 1. But I'm sorry, I'm just thinking it's a bunch of the boys from college doing this. It just made me think of that. I'm sure it's about to get dark. Connor, this is serious. You can't blah, blah. I know. And also, like, at first, when I saw, like, and they were given sunglasses, before the explanation, the thing that popped into my mind immediately was for the aura, because they look tough. And to hide the eyes, that makes more logical sense. I understand. But let's watch this.
Soon the mood began to shift.
On day 2, there was a very sharp change in the whole nature of what was happening in that prison.
The guards started raising their voices. Guards punished prisoners for minor mistakes. Their authority was settling in.
The guards then began to escalate their use of power. Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands.
If a prisoner resisted, they were locked in a small closet. This was their version of solitary confinement. Within the first 4 days, 3 prisoners were so affected that they were released. By the 5th day, the remaining prisoners looked exhausted. When they lined up for inspection, they seemed scared. The guards acted differently too. They were now tyrannical. It seemed like they forgot that they were just students in an experiment. The situation was out of control. It was just a matter of time before someone got hurt.
And at that point, we said, enough, we have to end this.
The experiment was scheduled to last 14 days, but Zimbardo shut it down on the 6th day. In 1972, Zimbardo talked about his experiment at conferences. He also released a film showing real footage of what happened. Public reaction was intense. Some people refused to believe the results. They argued that Zimbardo unknowingly selected people who were predisposed to authoritarianism, but others believed the experiment proved Zimbardo's theory. Normal people can change when placed into powerful or powerless roles. Decades later, the Stanford prison experiment is still debated. The consequences of this next experiment affected thousands of people and
I've always found that solitary confinement to me is almost like, that almost seems like torture. Like, that almost seems like something that should be outlawed by the Geneva Convention. I mean, I'm someone who sticks by myself quite a bit, but it's like, that has serious mental, like, repercussions. Even for, not even people like me who's like, I'm cool being by myself a bit more. Even someone like me, that would be so unbelievably, like, terrifying and scary, and I wouldn't want this. And I'm going to leave the last one if you want to watch the original video and subscribe to that creator. I'm sure the last one's great. But also, subscribe to this channel and watch one of the videos on screen right now if you're just binging, and